I never thought the company holiday party at the Fairmont Grand Ballroom would end with my husband Michael announcing our divorce to 300 of our colleagues, friends, and business partners, while I stood frozen in my emerald green gown, holding a champagne flute that suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Even less could I have imagined the absolute silence that followed his carefully rehearsed speech about amicable separation and exciting new chapters, or the way every face in that glittering crowd turned toward me with a mixture of pity and curiosity that made my skin burn with humiliation. But what Michael Davidson couldn't have anticipated, what none of them could have foreseen, was that exactly 48 hours later, I would be standing at that same podium, announcing my acquisition of Davidson Strategic Consulting, the company he had built on the foundation of my family's connections, my financial backing, and my silent partnership that he had systematically erased from every success story he told. The Fairmont's Grand Ballroom sparkled with the kind of understated elegance that Michael had always insisted upon for company events. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in cream silk, each centerpiece a carefully arranged display of white roses and winter greenery that must have cost more than most people's monthly salary. The room buzzed with the comfortable conversations of established professionals, the kind of networking atmosphere where deals were discussed over champagne and careers were advanced through strategic small talk. I had chosen my dress specifically for this evening, a deep emerald silk that complemented my dark hair and brought out the green in my hazel eyes. The color had always been my favorite, ever since my grandmother told me it represented growth and renewal. Tonight, it felt like armor, though I didn't yet understand why I might need protection at what should have been a celebration of our company's most successful year to date. Davidson Strategic Consulting had exceeded every projection for the third consecutive year. Our client retention rate was the highest in the industry. Our team had grown from 12 to 47 employees, and we had just secured the Morrison Industries contract, the largest deal in the company's 7-year history. By every measure, this should have been a night of triumph. I moved through the crowd with practiced ease, the skills my mother had drilled into me during countless charity galas and business functions serving me well. A warm smile for the Hendersons from Morrison Industries. Genuine enthusiasm when discussing the new marketing campaign with our creative team. Careful attention to each conversation that made every person feel valued and heard. These weren't just business acquaintances to me. Many had become genuine friends over the years, people whose children I knew by name, whose struggles and successes I had shared. "Sarah, you look absolutely radiant tonight," called Patricia Wells, our head of human resources, as she approached with her husband James. "That color is stunning on you. Michael must be so proud to have you by his side for tonight's celebration." I smiled, though something in her tone caught my attention. There was an undercurrent of careful observation, as if she were studying my reaction rather than simply offering a compliment. "Thank you, Patricia. You know how much these team celebrations mean to both of us. Everyone has worked so hard this year." James Wells shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the head table where Michael stood engaged in animated conversation with several board members from Morrison Industries. "Absolutely, the team has been incredible. The Morrison deal especially. That was really something special. The way everything came together. Again, that strange emphasis, that sense of words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning. I had noticed it throughout the evening. Small moments where conversations seemed to pause just a beat too long, where glances were exchanged that I couldn't quite interpret. The atmosphere felt charged in a way that went beyond typical pre-dinner anticipation. "Sarah!" The voice belonged to Jennifer Chang, our lead strategist, and one of my closest friends at the company. She approached quickly, her usual composed demeanor slightly frayed around the edges. "Could I speak with you for just a moment? Privately?" We stepped toward a quieter corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. The December evening was clear, and Philadelphia's lights stretched out below us like scattered diamonds. Jennifer glanced around carefully. Before speaking, her voice low and urgent. "Sarah, I don't know how to say this, but something's happening tonight. Something you need to be prepared for." Her hands twisted the stem of her wineglass nervously. "Michael asked me to prepare a presentation for tonight that I thought was strange. When I tried to ask questions about it, he told me it wasn't my concern, and that I should just follow instructions." A cold feeling began to settle in my stomach. "What kind of presentation?" "Financial projections and reorganization charts. New organizational structures that don't include you in any leadership capacity." Jennifer's eyes were wide with concern. "Sarah, it looks like he's planning to restructure the entire company. Your name isn't on any of the documents as holding a position of authority." The words hit me like ice water, but some part of me wasn't entirely surprised. Over the past 6 months, I had noticed subtle changes in how company decisions were being made. Meetings that I wasn't invited to, despite being a founding partner. Strategic decisions that were presented to me as already finalized, rather than discussed in advance. Client communications that were redirected through Michael's office instead of coming to me directly as they had for years. Each incident, viewed in isolation, had seemed reasonable. Michael was the CEO, after all, and as the company grew, it made sense that some operational aspects would become more centralized. I had rationalized each change as a natural evolution of our business partnership, a sign of our success rather, than a systematic exclusion from the company I had helped create. "Jennifer, are you certain about this?" I asked quietly, though my mind was already racing through the implications of what she was telling me. She nodded grimly. "I've been working on those documents for 2 weeks. At first, I thought maybe he was just exploring different structural options, but when I saw the final versions yesterday, it became clear this isn't theoretical planning. This is a comprehensive restructuring that removes you from operational authority while maintaining your financial obligations to the company." The financial obligations. My stomach dropped further as I remembered the personal guarantees I had signed on the company's credit lines, the collateral I had provided from my trust fund to secure our office lease and equipment financing. If Michael restructured the company to exclude me from leadership while keeping me liable for its debts, I would bear all the financial risk with none of the control to protect those investments. "There's something else," Jennifer continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rebecca from accounting mentioned that Michael has been having private meetings with Harrison Legal Group. That's the firm that specializes in business dissolutions and partnership disputes." Before I could respond, the sound of someone tapping a microphone drew our attention back to the main area of the ballroom. Michael stood at the podium that had been set up near the head table, his commanding presence immediately drawing the focus of everyone in the room. At 6'2", with silver gray hair and the kind of confident bearing that naturally attracted attention, he looked every inch the successful CEO in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Good evening, everyone," his voice carried clearly through the ballroom's sound system. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate another extraordinary year for Davidson Strategic Consulting." Applause filled the room, and I found myself clapping automatically while my mind reeled from Jennifer's revelations. Michael's smile was warm and engaging as he acknowledged different tables, making eye contact with key clients and team members. This was the man I had fallen in love with 8 years ago, whose vision and ambition had inspired me to leave my secure position at my father's investment firm to help him build something new and innovative. "Before we begin dinner and the formal presentation of this year's achievements," Michael continued, "I have a personal announcement that I wanted to share with all of you, the people who have become not just colleagues but family to Sarah and me over these incredible years we've built this company together." My heart began to pound. The way he had phrased that, the emphasis on past tense, the carefully constructed separation between his individual identity and our partnership, sent alarm bells through every instinct I possessed. I glanced around the room and noticed that several people were looking at me with expressions of sympathy that made no sense given the context of a business celebration. "Change is never easy," Michael continued, his tone taking on the measured cadence he used during difficult client presentations. "But sometimes, evolution requires us to make choices that, while painful in the short term, create space for new growth and opportunities that benefit everyone involved." The room had grown completely silent. Even the servers had stopped moving, standing still along the walls as if they too sensed the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. Michael's eyes found mine across the crowded room, and for a moment, I saw something I had never seen before in our years together. Not love, not partnership, not even respect. Just calculation. After much careful consideration and discussion, with both personal and professional advisors, he said, his voice remaining steady while my world began to tilt off its axis. "Sarah and I have decided to pursue separate paths, both personally and professionally. We will be filing for divorce next week and simultaneously implementing a restructuring of Davidson Strategic Consulting that will allow the company to move forward with the kind of focused leadership that our continued growth requires." The silence that followed was deafening. 300 people sat frozen, champagne glasses halfway to lips, conversations cut off mid-sentence, the only sound the soft jazz music that continued playing from the speakers as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In 30 seconds, Michael had dismantled not just our marriage but my entire professional identity, doing it publicly, in front of every person whose respect and partnership I valued. I felt as though I was watching the scene from outside my body, seeing myself standing in that emerald green dress, champagne flute still in my hand, face carefully controlled despite the earthquake happening beneath my feet. Years of social training kicked in automatically, maintaining my composure even as my mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. The first person to move was Morrison himself, the elderly gentleman whose company represented our largest client contract. He stood slowly from his seat at the head table, his weathered face grave with concern. "Perhaps," he said in his distinctive southern drawl that carried clearly in the silent room, "this would be an appropriate time for me to express Morrison, industry's gratitude to both Michael and Sarah for their exceptional work this year." His diplomatic intervention seemed to break the spell that had frozen the room. Conversations resumed in hushed whispers, people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some standing to move closer to friends or colleagues as if seeking safety in familiar connections. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But I remained exactly where I was, still processing the carefully orchestrated nature of what had just happened. This wasn't a spontaneous announcement born of sudden marital crisis. This was a calculated business maneuver, timed precisely to occur in front of our most important stakeholders, designed to establish a specific narrative about the future of the company before I had any opportunity to present my own perspective or protect my interests. Michael had weaponized our personal relationship to execute what was essentially a hostile takeover of the company we had built together. Patricia Wells appeared at my elbow, her face etched with concern. "Sarah, honey, are you all right? Can I get you anything? Some water, or maybe we should step outside for some air?" I turned to look at her, this woman who had been part of our team for 5 years, who had helped me interview candidates and plan company retreats, who had celebrated promotions and commiserated over lost deals. Her concern was genuine, but I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She was already calculating what this announcement meant for her own position, wondering which side of this sudden divide would prove safer for her career. "I'm fine, Patricia," I managed, my voice sounding surprisingly steady to my own ears. "Just processing some unexpected news." But I wasn't fine. As the reality of my situation began to crystallize, I felt a combination of rage and determination that surprised me. With its intensity, Michael had made a fundamental miscalculation. He had assumed that public humiliation would leave me too stunned and embarrassed to mount any effective response. He had counted on my social conditioning, my desire to avoid creating scenes or confrontations, to keep me paralyzed while he consolidated control. What he hadn't anticipated was that beneath the carefully cultivated exterior of the supportive business partner and accommodating wife, I had inherited more than just my grandmother's emerald dress preferences. I had inherited her steel spine and her absolute refusal to be dismissed or diminished by anyone, regardless of their strategy or social position. Jennifer appeared beside me again, her earlier nervousness replaced by clear anger. "Sarah, this is unbelievable. The way he did this, in front of everyone without any warning or discussion, it's not just unprofessional, it's cruel." I nodded, still watching Michael as he moved through the crowd, accepting condolences and assurances of continued support with the same easy charm he had always possessed. Several board members from Morrison Industries had gathered around him, and I could see the relief on their faces. They now had a clear single point of contact for their contract, no messy partnership complications to navigate, no questions about who held final authority on their account. "Jennifer," I said quietly, my mind beginning to organize itself around a plan that was still forming but growing clearer by the moment. "Tomorrow morning, I want you to pull together every piece of documentation you have about company performance, client relationships, and operational procedures. Everything. Don't tell anyone else what you're doing, and don't use company systems to compile it. Can you do that?" She studied my face, and whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. "Absolutely. Sarah, whatever you're planning, you should know that most of the team is furious about how this happened. This isn't just about business relationships. People care about you personally. They're not going to just accept this without question." Her words provided the first warmth I had felt since Michael's announcement. The relationships I had built with our team, the genuine connections and mutual respect we had developed, weren't just professional conveniences. They were real partnerships based on shared values and demonstrated integrity. Michael might control the corporate structure, but he didn't control the loyalty and trust I had earned through years of authentic leadership. As dinner was served, and the evening progressed with surreal normalcy, I moved through the remaining social obligations with automatic precision. I accepted sympathetic comments with grace, deflected questions about the future with diplomatic non-answers, and maintained the kind of dignified composure that would be remembered long after the shock of the announcement had faded. But beneath that carefully controlled exterior, I was conducting a thorough mental inventory of every resource, every relationship, and every piece of leverage I possessed independent of my marriage to Michael. The trust fund my grandmother had established, which I had used to help finance the company's early growth. The professional relationships I had cultivated before I ever met Michael, connections from my previous position at Richardson Investments that had nothing to do with Davidson Strategic Consulting, the detailed knowledge I possessed of every client account, every operational procedure, and every strategic initiative the company had developed over 7 years. Most importantly, I was remembering conversations from our early days together, when Michael had been more open about his business philosophy and methods. His belief that partnerships were temporary conveniences, useful until one party gained enough independent strength to eliminate the need for sharing control or profits. His admiration for executives who could execute clean separations from early investors or founding partners once those relationships became more burden than benefit. I had dismissed those comments at the time as theoretical business discussion, never imagining that I might eventually be classified as a partnership that had outlived its usefulness. But viewing our entire relationship through that lens, the gradual changes in how decisions were made, the subtle marginalization of my role, the careful documentation of company assets and intellectual property under his individual control rather than our joint ownership, All of it fit a pattern I had been too trusting or too naive to recognize. The evening finally concluded with the traditional toast to the company's continued success. Michael raised his glass, offering words about resilience, adaptation, and the exciting opportunities that lay ahead for Davidson Strategic Consulting under its new focused leadership structure. The applause was polite, but notably less enthusiastic than usual, and I noticed several team members exchanging glances that suggested private conversations would be happening before morning. As guests began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes, Morrison himself approached me directly, his weathered face grave with concern. "Mrs. Davidson?" he began, then paused and corrected himself. "Ms. Richardson. I believe that's your preference now?" "Sarah Richardson." I hadn't used my maiden name in 8 years, but hearing it spoken aloud felt like reconnecting with an identity I had allowed to become submerged in the partnership that was now dissolved. "Yes, Mr. Morrison. Sarah Richardson." He nodded approvingly. "Ms. Richardson, I wanted you to know that Morrison Industries has been extremely pleased with the strategic guidance we've received over the past 2 years. Your insights into our international expansion possibilities and your management of the implementation process have been exceptional. Whatever changes lie ahead for Davidson Strategic, I hope we'll have opportunities to continue working together, in some capacity." His words carried clear implication. Morrison Industries' satisfaction with our services was specifically connected to my individual contributions, not just the company's general capabilities. This was valuable information, a potential foundation for whatever came next. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. That means a great deal to me. I'm certain we'll find ways to continue building on the success we've achieved together." After he departed, I found myself alone in the ballroom for a few moments, surrounded by the remnants of what should have been a celebration. Empty champagne glasses caught the light from the chandeliers. Flower arrangements that had seemed elegant hours earlier now appeared wilted and sad, and the whole room felt hollow in a way that had nothing to do with the departure of guests. Michael appeared beside me, his demeanor shifting from public CEO charm to something more personal, though still carefully controlled. "Sarah, I know tonight was difficult. I want you to understand that this wasn't about any failure on your part. You've been an incredible partner, both personally and professionally. But sometimes relationships run their course, and continuing beyond that point serves no one well." I turned to study his face, this man I had shared a bed with for 8 years, whose ambitions I had supported even when they required sacrifices from my own career goals, whose success I had celebrated as enthusiastically as my own achievements. Looking at him now, I realized I was seeing clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The charm was still there, the intelligence and strategic thinking that had initially attracted me. But underneath it all was a coldness I had somehow trained myself not to notice. "Michael," I said quietly, "do you remember the conversation we had 5 years ago about the Henderson Group takeover? You said that the most successful business maneuvers were the ones where the target never saw it coming, where they were so focused on maintaining the partnership that they missed all the signs of preparation for separation." His expression shifted slightly, wariness replacing the practiced sympathy. "That was a different situation entirely, Sarah. That was about corporate acquisition strategy, not personal relationships." "Was it?" I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. "Because from where I'm standing right now, it seems like the same fundamental approach. Identify the target's vulnerabilities, gradually isolate them from independent resources, establish narrative control, then execute the separation when they're least prepared to mount effective resistance." Michael was quiet for a long moment, and I could see him calculating whether to continue the pretense of wounded personal sentiment or acknowledge the business reality of what had just occurred. Finally, he chose honesty, perhaps respecting me enough to drop the performance now that it was no longer necessary. "You're right," he said simply. "This is a business decision that required business methodology. I'm sorry it had to be executed this way, But clean separations are less damaging for everyone involved than prolonged negotiations that create uncertainty for clients and employees. There it was. The acknowledgement that this entire evening, possibly our entire marriage, had been evaluated through the lens of strategic business advantage. I felt a strange sense of relief at finally having clarity about the situation, even though that clarity was devastating in its implications. "I appreciate your honesty," I replied, and meant it. "It helps me understand the parameters of what happens next." Something in my tone must have caught his attention because his confidence wavered slightly. "Sarah, I hope you understand that fighting this separation would only make things more difficult for both of us. The restructuring is already in process. The legal framework is established, and Morrison Industries has already expressed their preference for simplified leadership moving forward." I smiled, an expression that seemed to surprise him. "Michael, you've made an assumption that I think you'll find was incorrect." "What assumption?" "That I would be the target in this scenario, rather than recognizing that I might have been preparing for a different kind of separation myself." I gathered my evening bag and wrap, moving toward the ballroom exit with the same composed dignity I had maintained throughout the evening. "Thank you for a very educational night. I'll be in touch with you soon about the next steps." As I walked away, leaving him standing alone among the empty champagne glasses and wilted flower arrangements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The exhilarating combination of absolute clarity about my situation and complete confidence in my ability to change it. Michael had executed his strategy flawlessly, but he had based it on fundamental misunderstanding of who I was beneath the accommodating wife and supportive business partner he had seen for 8 years. Tomorrow, he would begin to discover exactly what Sarah Richardson was capable of when she stopped pretending to be someone else's supporting character and started writing her own story instead. The next morning arrived gray and bitter, December wind rattling the windows of my Rittenhouse Square apartment as I sat at my grandmother's mahogany desk, surrounded by financial documents and legal papers that painted a picture I should have seen developing years earlier. The coffee had grown cold in my cup, but I barely noticed, my attention completely absorbed by the systematic documentation of how thoroughly Michael had prepared for this moment. The prenuptial agreement we had signed 8 years ago, which I had barely read at the time because I trusted him completely, contained clauses that effectively separated our business interests in ways that heavily favored whoever maintained operational control of Davidson Strategic Consulting. My personal financial contributions to the company had been structured as loans rather than equity investments, meaning I was technically a creditor rather than an owner, despite having provided nearly 60% of the initial capital and ongoing operational funding. Even more disturbing was the discovery that the intellectual property agreements I had signed during our second year in business had been quietly amended 3 times, each modification subtly reducing my ownership stake in the proprietary methodologies and client relationships I had developed. The amendments had been presented to me as routine legal updates, necessary for maintaining compliance with changing business regulations, and I had signed them without independent legal review because they came from Michael, my husband, and business partner. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Emergency team meeting called for 9 a.m. Michael says mandatory attendance. Several people asking if you'll be there. Should I tell them anything? I stared at the message, understanding immediately what was happening. Michael was moving quickly to consolidate control, probably planning to address the team's concerns about last night's announcement while establishing new reporting structures and operational procedures. He would want to contain any potential defections or resistance before people had time to fully process what had occurred or consider their options. I typed back quickly. Tell them I'll be addressing the team myself this afternoon. Don't attend. Michael's meeting. Trust me on this. The response came immediately. Already planned to skip it. Half the team feels the same way. We're meeting at Cafe Luna at 10 if you want to join us. A surge of warmth cut through the cold fury that had been building since last night. The relationships I had cultivated with our employees weren't just professional conveniences that would automatically transfer loyalty to whoever controlled the corporate structure. These were genuine partnerships built on mutual respect and shared values, and they were proving more resilient than Michael had anticipated. I spent the next hour making calls to contacts I hadn't spoken with in months, people from my previous career at Richardson Investments who had maintained their respect for my strategic abilities despite my departure to help build Davidson Strategic. The conversations were illuminating, not just for the opportunities they revealed, but for the perspective they provided on how my partnership with Michael was viewed from outside our immediate circle. Sarah, I have to tell you, I never understood why you submerged your talents in that setup, said Marcus Wellington, managing director at Hartfield Capital. Your work on the Morrison expansion analysis was brilliant, but everyone in the industry knows Davidson takes credit for strategies that clearly bear your fingerprints. We've been hoping you'd eventually realize you could build something much bigger on your own. Each conversation reinforced the same theme. My professional reputation existed independently of my marriage to Michael, and many industry leaders had been watching the dynamics of our partnership with concern rather than admiration. What I had interpreted as successful collaboration, they had recognized as systematic marginalization of my contributions. By 9:30, I was ready for the meeting at Café Luna. The small coffee shop near our office had become an unofficial gathering place for our team over the years, where real conversations happened away from the formal atmosphere of corporate conference rooms. When I arrived, I found 12 of our 17 employees already assembled, their faces reflecting a mixture of anger, confusion, and determination that matched my own emotional state. Jennifer stood as I entered, her expression fierce with loyalty. Sarah, we need you to know that nobody's buying this restructuring narrative. What happened last night wasn't a business decision, it was character assassination. Michael's trying to erase 7 years of your contributions and pretend the company's success just happened around you instead of because of you. A chorus of agreement filled the small space, and I felt tears threaten for the first time since the previous evening. These people hadn't just worked for Davidson Strategic, they had worked with me, building something meaningful together, and they understood the difference between authentic leadership and mere corporate authority. Thank you, I said quietly, taking a seat at the large table they had arranged by pushing several smaller ones together. That means more to me than you can imagine. But I want to be completely honest with all of you about what we're facing. Over the next hour, I laid out the reality of our situation with the same transparency I had always brought to difficult client conversations. Michael had legal control of the company structure, the primary client contracts, and the physical assets. The team's employment agreements contained non-compete clauses that would prevent them from immediately joining any rival firm. Most challenging, our largest clients had established relationships that were technically with Davidson Strategic as an entity, not with individual team members. But here's what Michael didn't anticipate, I continued, watching their faces as I shifted from problem identification to strategic response. His entire approach assumes that corporate control equals actual influence, and that's only true if everyone accepts the legitimacy of that control. I opened my laptop and connected it to the portable projector I had brought, displaying a comprehensive analysis I had been developing since 3 a.m. Morrison Industries represents 40% of our revenue, but they're not just purchasing generic consulting services. They're purchasing specific strategic methodologies that I developed, implemented by a team that I recruited and trained, building on relationships that existed before Davidson Strategic was even incorporated. The slides that followed detailed an alternative business structure that would allow the team to continue serving our existing clients while technically operating outside the constraints of their current employment agreements. Rather than competing directly with Davidson Strategic, we would be providing independent consulting services to clients who chose to work with us voluntarily. Sarah, this is brilliant, said Marcus Chen, our senior analyst. But what about startup costs? Office space, equipment, initial operating capital? Most of us don't have the financial resources to launch something like this without significant backing. I smiled, feeling the first genuine optimism I had experienced in months. That's where Michael made his biggest miscalculation. He assumed that divorcing me would leave me financially dependent on whatever settlement terms he offered. What he forgot is that my grandmother's trust fund exists independently of our marriage, and I've never touched the principal. The trust fund that my grandmother Elizabeth Richardson had established contained not just liquid assets, but a diversified portfolio of investments that had grown substantially over the 15 years since her death. More importantly, the fund included specific provisions for business ventures that aligned with my grandmother's values of ethical leadership and genuine partnership. Here's what I'm proposing, I continued, advancing to the next slide. Richardson Strategic Partners, a consulting firm that operates on genuine partnership principles. Everyone in this room becomes an equity partner rather than an employee, sharing in both the responsibilities and the rewards of what we build together. The excitement in the room was palpable as I outlined the structure I had developed. Unlike traditional consulting firms that concentrated ownership among senior partners, while junior staff remained essentially hired labor, Richardson Strategic would distribute equity based on contribution rather than seniority or initial capital investment. The team members who chose to join would receive immediate ownership stakes that reflected their specific expertise and client relationships. "What about Michael?" asked Jennifer. "He's not going to just accept that his entire team is leaving to start a competing firm. Michael's going to discover that controlling a corporate structure isn't the same as controlling the relationships and expertise that make that structure valuable," I replied. "Davidson Strategic without this team is essentially an empty shell, with some expensive office furniture and a list of phone numbers." We spent the rest of the morning working through the practical details of transition: which clients were most likely to follow us voluntarily, how to structure the partnership agreements to ensure everyone's interests were protected, what timeline would minimize disruption to ongoing projects while maximizing our chances of successful launch. By noon, 8 team members had committed to joining Richardson Strategic, with 4 others requesting time to consider their options. As the meeting concluded and people began leaving to return to their regular work, Jennifer lingered behind with a concerned expression. "Sarah, there's something else you should know about this morning's meeting with Michael. Rebecca from accounting mentioned that he's been in contact with Kendall and Associates about potentially acquiring Davidson Strategic's client list and operational systems. Kendall and Associates was one of the largest consulting firms in the IE region, known for aggressive acquisition strategies and cost-cutting approaches that prioritized profit margins over client relationships or employee development. If Michael was already exploring sale options, it confirmed that his restructuring announcement wasn't about improving company operations, but about positioning Davidson Strategic as an attractive acquisition target. How far along are those discussions?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. According to Rebecca, they've already conducted preliminary due diligence. She thinks a deal could be finalized within 60 days if Michael decides to move forward. The timeline suddenly became much more urgent. If Michael sold Davidson Strategic to Kendall, our current clients would find themselves transferred to a firm with completely different values and methodologies. The personal relationships we had built would be irrelevant to Kendall's standardized service delivery model, and the innovative approaches that had made us successful would be abandoned in favor of their established procedures. "Jennifer, I need you to do something that might feel uncomfortable, but it's essential for protecting our clients' interests," I said, my mind racing through the implications of this new information. "Can you discreetly reach out to our top 5 clients and let them know that Richardson Strategic will be launching soon, and that we'd be honored to continue serving their needs in our new capacity?" She nodded without hesitation. "Already planned to do that. Morrison Industries especially needs to know what's happening. They've invested too much in our current projects to have everything disrupted by a corporate acquisition that doesn't serve their interests. As I drove back to my apartment, I reflected on how completely the situation had transformed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning, I had been a marginalized partner in a company I had helped create, gradually losing influence while convincing myself that accommodation was the same as partnership. Tonight, I was the founder of a new firm with a committed team and the financial resources to compete effectively against the very organization that had tried to erase me. The phone call I had been expecting came at 6 p.m., just as I was reviewing partnership agreements with the attorney I had retained that afternoon. Michael's name appeared on my caller ID, and I let it ring twice before answering, using the time to center myself for whatever manipulation or intimidation he might attempt. "Sarah, we need to talk." His voice carried the controlled tension I remembered from his most difficult client negotiations. "This situation is getting out of hand. I've heard rumors about you trying to poach our employees and steal our clients. That's not just unethical. It's potentially illegal, given the non-compete agreements and confidentiality obligations involved." I settled back in my chair, surprised by how calm I felt, despite the clear threat in his words. "Michael, I haven't approached any of your employees. Several of them have expressed interest in joining a new venture that aligns better with their professional values, but that's their choice to make. Don't be naive, Sarah. You know exactly what you're doing, and you know the legal risks you're creating for yourself and anyone who follows you. I'm prepared to be reasonable about our personal separation, but business interference won't be tolerated." The shift from wounded husband to corporate enforcer was jarring, but not surprising. This was the Michael I had glimpsed occasionally during our marriage, usually when dealing with competitors or suppliers who didn't accept his initial terms. The charm and collaboration were tools he deployed strategically, but underneath lay a much harder calculation about power and control. "I'm not interfering with your business, Michael. I'm starting my own business, using my own resources, and offering opportunities to professionals who want to work in a different kind of environment. If that creates competition for Davidson Strategic, perhaps you should examine why your employees and clients might prefer alternatives." "This conversation is over," he said curtly. "But understand that I will protect my company's interests by any means necessary. I suggest you consult with legal counsel about the potential consequences of your current course of action." After he hung up, I sat quietly for several minutes, processing the clear escalation in his approach. The threat of legal action wasn't surprising, but the speed and intensity of his response suggested that our morning meeting had been more disruptive to his plans than I had anticipated. He had expected compliance, or at least paralysis, while I processed the shock of his announcement. Instead, he was discovering that systematic preparation could work in both directions. My attorney called back within an hour with preliminary research on the legal issues Michael had raised. The non-compete agreements our team members had signed were problematic, but not insurmountable, particularly if they were joining a partnership structure rather than simply changing employers. More importantly, the confidentiality obligations that prevented sharing specific client information didn't restrict general business relationships or prevent clients from choosing to work with different service providers. The key legal principle here is restraint of trade, explained Sarah Chen, the employment attorney I had retained. Courts are generally reluctant to enforce agreements that prevent professionals from using their skills and expertise, especially when those agreements are overly broad or were signed under circumstances that didn't adequately protect the employee's interests. She continued with an analysis that reinforced my growing confidence in our position. Given that your husband apparently used the company's legal resources to structure these agreements in ways that benefit his position in a marital separation, there are strong arguments that the agreements were created in bad faith rather than for legitimate business protection. By the end of our conversation, I understood that Michael's legal threats, while serious, were less intimidating than he intended them to be. The law generally favored competition and professional mobility over restrictive employment agreements, especially when those agreements were being used to prevent legitimate business development rather than protect genuine trade secrets. The following morning brought the first test of our new dynamic. Morrison Industries called requesting an emergency consultation about their European expansion timeline, a project that had been stalled for months while Davidson Strategic developed the implementation strategy. Under normal circumstances, this would have been routed through Michael's office, but Morrison's assistant specifically asked to speak with me directly. "Ms. Richardson," said James Morrison's familiar voice when I returned the call, "I hope you don't mind the direct approach, but we're facing some urgent decisions about our London office launch, and frankly, we need the kind of strategic thinking you've provided on our previous expansions." I chose my words carefully, aware that this conversation would set important precedents for how client relationships would evolve. "Mr. Morrison, I'm honored by your confidence, and I want to ensure that Morrison Industries receives the best possible guidance for this crucial project. However, I should mention that my professional situation has changed recently, and I want to be completely transparent about the options available to you. Ms. Richardson, I'm going to be direct with you. Morrison Industries values relationships with people, not corporate entities. We've worked with you for 3 years because you understand our business culture and our strategic goals. If you're available to continue that partnership in a different capacity, we're very interested in discussing the possibilities." The conversation that followed lasted over an hour and resulted in Morrison Industries becoming the first official client of Richardson Strategic Partners, with a contract value that exceeded anything Davidson Strategic had ever negotiated. More importantly, Morrison's decision to work with us directly sent a clear signal to other clients about the real source of value in our previous business relationships. Over the next week, similar conversations occurred with 4 other major clients. Each had specific reasons for preferring to continue working with me and our team, rather than transferring their business to whatever new structure Michael might establish at Davidson Strategic. The personal relationships, the understanding of their unique challenges, and the proven track record of successful collaboration weren't corporate assets that could be transferred automatically to new management. The speed of these client transitions clearly caught Michael off guard. I learned from Jennifer, who was still technically employed at Davidson Strategic while working through her transition timeline, that he had expected a much longer period of uncertainty during which clients would remain with the established firm rather than risk working with a startup organization. He's been making calls all week trying to convince clients that Richardson Strategic doesn't have the resources or stability to handle major projects, Jennifer reported during one of our evening planning sessions. But Morrison Industries apparently told him directly that they prefer working with established relationships rather than corporate structures. The validation was gratifying, but I remained focused on the fundamental challenge of building something sustainable rather than just winning a competition against Michael. Richardson Strategic needed to prove itself as more than just a rebellion against Davidson's approach. We had to demonstrate superior value through innovation, partnership, and results that exceeded what traditional consulting firms could deliver. The breakthrough came when we implemented the collaborative methodology I had been developing for over 2 years, but had never been allowed to fully deploy at Davidson Strategic. Instead of the traditional consultant-client hierarchy where expertise flowed from service provider to customer, Richardson Strategic operated on genuine partnership principles where client knowledge and consulting methodology combined to create solutions that neither party could develop independently. Our first major success using this approach came with Morrison Industries' European expansion. Rather than delivering a predetermined implementation plan, we worked collaboratively with their international development team to design a launch strategy that incorporated both our analytical framework and their operational expertise. The result was a plan that not only addressed their immediate expansion goals, but created scalable systems for future international growth. The project's success generated industry attention that exceeded anything Davidson Strategic had ever achieved. Business publications wrote feature articles about our innovative approach to consultant-client partnership, and we began receiving inquiries from organizations that wanted to work with firms that challenged traditional service delivery models. "Sarah, you've created something genuinely revolutionary here," observed Dr. Patricia Williams, the business school dean who had tracked our development since launch. "This isn't just a successful consulting firm, it's a demonstration that professional services can operate on genuine partnership principles rather than the artificial hierarchies that most firms take for granted." But perhaps the most satisfying validation came from an unexpected source. Rebecca from accounting, who had remained at Davidson Strategic to monitor developments there, reported that Michael was struggling to replace the expertise and client relationships that had departed with our team. 2 major projects had been suspended indefinitely, and 3 prospective clients had withdrawn their requests for proposals after learning about the company's recent changes. He's been trying to hire senior consultants from other firms, but apparently nobody wants to join an organization that's dealing with this level of internal disruption, Rebecca explained during a confidential lunch meeting. Kendall and Associates is still interested in acquisition discussions, but their valuation has dropped significantly since they can't count on the client relationships and project pipeline that existed 6 months ago. The irony wasn't lost on me. Michael's strategy for removing me from Davidson Strategic was systematically destroying the value of the company he was trying to protect. By treating the business as a collection of assets that could be controlled through corporate structure rather than a network of relationships that required ongoing cultivation, he had fundamentally misunderstood the source of our success. As Richardson Strategic's first month concluded, I found myself reflecting on how completely my understanding of professional partnership had evolved. For years, I had accepted marginalization as a natural consequence of business growth, interpreting the gradual erosion of my authority as evidence of Michael's superior strategic thinking, rather than recognizing it as systematic manipulation designed to facilitate exactly the kind of separation I had experienced. The transformation wasn't just professional, but deeply personal. I was rediscovering aspects of my identity that had been submerged during years of accommodating Michael's vision of what our partnership should look like. The confidence, creativity, and strategic boldness that had characterized my earlier career were resurging, no longer filtered through someone else's approval or constrained by their comfort level with my success. Standing in the conference room of our new offices, looking out at a team of genuine partners rather than hierarchical employees, I understood that Michael had actually done me an enormous favor. His public announcement of our separation had forced me to confront realities I might have continued rationalizing indefinitely, and his assumption that I would accept marginalization had catalyzed a response that exceeded anything I might have achieved while remaining in our compromised partnership. The woman who had stood frozen in that emerald green dress while her husband dismantled her professional identity was discovering that she possessed resources, relationships, and capabilities that existed completely independently of anyone else's recognition or permission. Richardson Strategic Partners wasn't just succeeding, it was redefining what success looked like in our industry, proving that authentic partnership could create value that traditional hierarchical structures couldn't match. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was brief but unmistakable in its implication. "Congratulations on your first month. Looking forward to seeing what you accomplish in year 2. A longtime admirer of your work." I never learned who sent that message, but it arrived at exactly the moment when I needed confirmation that my efforts were being noticed by people beyond my immediate circle. Richardson Strategic wasn't just competing successfully against Davidson Strategic. We were becoming a recognized leader in innovative business partnership, attracting attention from industry observers who valued substance over conventional status markers. The foundation was established, the team was thriving, and our clients were achieving results that validated our collaborative approach. What had begun as a response to personal and professional betrayal was evolving into something much more significant. A demonstration that authentic partnership principles could create business success that exceeded what manipulation and control could achieve. But I knew that Michael wouldn't accept this outcome without further resistance, and that the real test of Richardson Strategic's resilience was still ahead. Building something meaningful was only the first step. Protecting it from those who viewed success as a zero-sum competition would require strategies I was only beginning to develop. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by a courier who seemed almost apologetic about the thick manila envelope he placed in my hands. Inside were documents that represented Michael's most aggressive move yet. Comprehensive lawsuit alleging that Richardson Strategic Partners was built on stolen intellectual property, violated non-compete agreements, and constituted interference with Davidson Strategic's existing business relationships. The monetary damages he was seeking exceeded $2 million, an amount clearly calculated to force me into bankruptcy if I chose to fight, rather than surrender. I spread the papers across my dining room table, reading through each allegation, with the same analytical focus I brought to complex client strategies. Michael's attorneys had crafted their case skillfully, presenting a narrative that painted me as a vindictive ex-wife who had used privileged information to destroy the company that had supported our marriage. According to their version of events, Richardson's strategic success was entirely dependent on proprietary methodologies developed at Davidson Strategic, client relationships that belonged to the corporate entity rather than individual consultants, and trade secrets that I had misappropriated during my departure. The most disturbing aspect of the lawsuit wasn't the financial demands, which I could meet if necessary, but the way it reframed our entire professional history. Every innovation I had developed, every client relationship I had cultivated, every strategic breakthrough that had contributed to Davidson Strategic's growth, was now characterized as corporate property that I had essentially stolen when I left. The narrative completely erased my individual contributions while positioning Michael as the wronged party defending his legitimate business interests against theft and sabotage. My phone rang as I finished reviewing the final page. Jennifer's voice was tight with anger when I answered. "Sarah, have you seen the lawsuit yet? Because half our team just received similar papers claiming they violated their employment agreements by joining Richardson Strategic. Michael's trying to sue everyone who left Davidson into financial submission." The scope of his legal offensive was breathtaking in its comprehensiveness. Rather than focusing solely on me as the primary target, he was attacking every team member who had chosen to join our new firm, using their individual financial vulnerabilities to pressure them into abandoning Richardson Strategic and returning to Davidson. For most of our partners, the cost of defending against even frivolous litigation would be prohibitive, forcing them to choose between their principles and their financial survival. "Jennifer, can you get everyone together this afternoon? We need to address this situation collectively rather than allowing Michael to isolate us into individual legal battles," I said, my mind already working through response strategies. "And please contact Sarah Chen's office. Tell her we need an emergency meeting about coordinated defense strategies for multiple defendants." The team meeting that afternoon revealed the full extent of Michael's calculated assault on our business model. 8 of our 12 partners had received legal papers, each tailored to their specific circumstances and vulnerabilities. Marcus Chen, who had a mortgage and 2 children in private school, was being sued for allegedly taking proprietary client analysis methodologies. Jennifer faced claims that her departure had violated fiduciary duties to ongoing projects. Even our newest partner, David Kim, who had only been with Davidson Strategic for 6 months before joining us, was accused of breaching confidentiality agreements. "This isn't really about intellectual property or trade secrets," observed Dr. Patricia Williams, who had agreed to serve as an advisor to Richardson Strategic's development. "This is economic warfare designed to make continued operation so expensive and stressful that you voluntarily dissolve the partnership." Duh, she was absolutely right. Michael's strategy relied on the assumption that small business partnerships couldn't sustain the financial and emotional costs of prolonged litigation, especially when the legal expenses would have to be covered by individual partners rather than corporate resources. He was betting that our commitment to collaborative principles would crumble under the pressure of personal financial risk, "Here's what I propose," I said, looking around the conference room at faces that showed determination mixed with understandable concern. "Richardson Strategic will cover all legal expenses for defending against these lawsuits, and will structure the defense collectively rather than individually. Michael wants to force us into separate battles we can't afford to win. Instead, we'll present a unified front that demonstrates the strength of genuine partnership." The relief in the room was palpable, but I could see that several partners remained worried about the broader implications of extended legal conflict. Fighting Michael's lawsuits would consume time and energy that should be focused on serving clients and building our business. Even if we ultimately prevailed, the distraction and stress could undermine the collaborative culture that made Richardson Strategic distinctive. Sarah Chen arrived that evening with a preliminary analysis that provided both reassurance and sobering reality about our legal position. The good news was that Michael's claims, while aggressively presented, relied on legal theories that courts had historically been reluctant to enforce. The bad news was that defending against them would require substantial resources and could take months or even years to resolve completely. "The intellectual property claims are particularly weak," she explained, reviewing her notes. "Most of the methodologies he's claiming as proprietary were either industry-standard approaches or innovations that Sarah had documented developing before Davidson Strategic even existed. We have email records, client presentations, and academic papers that establish her individual ownership of these concepts." More promising was her analysis of the non-compete agreements that our partners had signed. These contracts are problematic for several reasons. First, they're overly broad in scope, attempting to prevent virtually any consulting work rather than protecting specific trade secrets. Second, they were apparently drafted using Davidson Strategic's legal resources without independent representation for the employees. Most importantly, there's evidence that they were modified repeatedly in ways that suggest they were designed to facilitate this exact scenario rather than protect legitimate business interests. The strategy we developed over the following week was aggressive and comprehensive. Rather than simply defending against Michael's allegations, we would file counterclaims alleging abuse of process, intentional interference with business relationships, and breach of fiduciary duty during our marriage. If Michael wanted to litigate our separation, we would ensure that all aspects of our professional and personal relationship received equal scrutiny. The breakthrough came when Sarah Chen discovered that Michael's legal strategy contained a fundamental vulnerability. In order to claim ownership of the client relationships and methodologies that Richardson Strategic was using, he had to demonstrate that these assets belonged to Davidson Strategic rather than to me individually. But doing so would require acknowledging that our marriage had been structured as a business partnership where my contributions were essential to the company's value. "He can't have it both ways," Sarah explained during our strategy session. "Either you were an equal partner whose departure significantly damaged Davidson Strategic's capabilities, or you were a marginal contributor whose loss shouldn't affect the company's operations. If he claims the former to support his lawsuit, he undermines his position in the divorce proceedings. If he maintains the latter, his intellectual property claims become much weaker." This legal contradiction became the foundation of our defense strategy. We would force Michael to choose between maximizing his claims in the business litigation or protecting his interests in the divorce settlement, but not both simultaneously. The discovery process would require him to produce documents and testimony that would reveal the true nature of our professional partnership, information that could significantly strengthen my position in the financial separation. The first major victory came sooner than expected. Morrison Industries, our largest client, filed a motion to intervene in the lawsuit, arguing that the litigation was disrupting essential business services and that they should have the right to choose their own service providers without interference from corporate disputes. Their legal filing included a detailed analysis of Richardson Strategic's performance compared to industry standards, demonstrating that our results were superior to what they had received from other consulting firms. "Morrison's intervention changes everything," Sarah Chen explained after reviewing their filing. They're essentially providing expert testimony that Richardson Strategic's success is based on superior service delivery rather than misappropriated trade secrets. Michael's attorneys will have difficulty arguing that you stole proprietary methodologies when your largest client is stating publicly that your approaches are innovative and original. The psychological impact of Morrison's support was as significant as the legal advantages it provided. Other clients began expressing similar views, and industry observers started questioning whether Michael's litigation was really about protecting intellectual property or simply attempting to eliminate competition through legal intimidation. Business publications began covering our story, not as a marital dispute, but as a case study in how established firms sometimes used litigation to stifle innovation and competitive threats. The publicity was transforming Richardson Strategic from a startup consulting firm into a symbol of entrepreneurial resistance against corporate manipulation. We began receiving inquiries from prospective clients who wanted to work with a firm that had demonstrated the courage to defend its principles against legal pressure. More surprisingly, we started hearing from other consulting professionals who had experienced similar treatment from former employers and were interested in joining an organization that would protect their individual contributions. Michael's response to these developments was swift and revealing. Rather than adjusting his legal strategy to account for the changing dynamics, he escalated his attacks, filing additional motions that sought to prevent Richardson Strategic from taking on new clients until the intellectual property claims were resolved. The desperation behind this approach was obvious to everyone involved, including his own attorneys, who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the aggressive tactics they were being asked to pursue. The turning point came during Michael's deposition, which Sarah Chen had strategically scheduled to occur before he could adequately prepare his testimony. Under oath, he was forced to answer detailed questions about my contributions to Davidson Strategic's development, the decision-making processes we had used during our partnership, and the specific innovations that he was now claiming as corporate property. "Mr. Davidson," Sarah asked during a particularly revealing exchange, "you've testified that the strategic methodology used in the Morrison Industries expansion was developed by Davidson Strategic as a corporate entity. Can you explain why your company's internal emails from that period consistently refer to this approach as Sarah's framework and Richardson's analysis model?" Michael's response revealed the fundamental weakness in his position. He couldn't acknowledge my individual contributions without undermining his claims that Richardson Strategic was built on stolen corporate assets, but he also couldn't deny the documentary evidence that clearly established my role in developing the very methodologies he was trying to claim as proprietary. The deposition transcripts, when they became available to the business press, painted a picture of a CEO who was either remarkably uninformed about his own company's operations or deliberately misrepresenting his ex-wife's contributions to protect his litigation strategy. Neither interpretation reflected well on his credibility or business acumen. The financial pressure of extended litigation was beginning to affect Davidson Strategic in ways that Michael apparently hadn't anticipated. Legal expenses were consuming resources that should have been invested in business development, and the negative publicity was making it difficult to attract new clients or retain existing relationships. Several prospective contracts were reportedly withdrawn when companies decided they didn't want to be associated with a firm involved in contentious legal disputes. More damaging was the departure of additional team members who had initially remained at Davidson Strategic, but were now questioning their association with Michael's approach to conflict resolution. The collaborative culture that had characterized our original partnership was being replaced by an atmosphere of suspicion and control that made creative work increasingly difficult. People are afraid to innovate because they're worried their ideas might be claimed as corporate property if they ever decide to leave, reported Rebecca, who was still monitoring developments at Davidson Strategic while considering her own departure. The legal department is reviewing everything now, and there's constant paranoia about information security and employee loyalty. It's becoming a miserable place to work. By spring, it was clear that Michael's litigation strategy was causing more damage to his own interests than to Richardson Strategic's development. Our client base had grown to exceed Davidson Strategic's current roster. Our revenue was approaching twice what the original company had generated at its peak, and our team had expanded to include some of the most talented consultants in the region. The contrast between our two firms' trajectories became a frequent topic in business school case studies and industry conferences. Richardson Strategic represented innovation, collaboration, and growth, while Davidson Strategic was increasingly seen as an example of how litigation could be used to stifle competition and protect failing business models. The resolution came through an unexpected channel. Dr. Williams, who had been observing our situation as both an advisor and academic researcher, suggested that we propose a structured mediation process that would allow both sides to resolve the dispute without the continued expense and uncertainty of extended litigation. Michael's position is becoming increasingly untenable, she explained during one of our strategy meetings. His legal costs are approaching the total damages he originally sought. His business reputation is suffering significant damage, and he's facing pressure from potential investors who are concerned about the ongoing litigation. If we can provide him with a face-saving resolution, he might be willing to accept terms that recognize Richardson Strategic's independence. The mediation proposal we developed was elegant in its simplicity. Richardson Strategic would agree to pay a nominal licensing fee for any methodologies that could be definitively traced to work performed during my employment at Davidson Strategic, while Michael would acknowledge that my subsequent innovations were independent intellectual property that Richardson Strategic owned completely. More importantly, both firms would agree to compete openly in the marketplace without further legal interference. Michael's initial response was predictably negative, but his attorneys were clearly advising him to consider settlement seriously. The litigation had evolved from a strategy for eliminating competition into a liability that was threatening Davidson Strategic's financial stability and reputation. The possibility of losing the lawsuit entirely, which would leave him responsible for our legal expenses in addition to his own, made continued fighting increasingly risky. The breakthrough came when Morrison Industries made it clear that they were considering terminating their relationship with Davidson Strategic entirely if the litigation continued to disrupt their business operations. As our largest mutual client, their position carried enormous weight in any realistic assessment of the lawsuit's potential outcomes. Morrison Industries has basically told Michael that they'll support whatever resolution allows them to continue working with Richardson Strategic without interference, Jennifer reported after a conversation with their procurement director. They've made it clear that they view the litigation as a distraction from business objectives, rather than a legitimate protection of intellectual property. The mediation session itself was anticlimactic after months of aggressive legal maneuvering. Michael arrived with his attorneys and a carefully controlled demeanor that suggested he had finally accepted the reality of his position. The settlement we negotiated was more favorable to Richardson Strategic than anything I had dared hope for when the litigation began. Under the terms of the agreement, Richardson Strategic would pay Davidson Strategic $50,000 in recognition of any shared developmental work, a fraction of what Michael had originally sought, and less than he had spent on legal fees. In exchange, he would acknowledge our firm's independent status and agree not to interfere with our client relationships or business operations. Most importantly, all of our partners would be released from their non-compete agreements, allowing them to pursue their careers without restriction. The personal aspects of our separation were resolved simultaneously, with a divorce settlement that recognized my individual contributions to our joint financial success. The prenuptial agreement that had seemed so protective of Michael's interests proved to be much less enforceable when my role in building Davidson Strategic's value was properly documented and acknowledged. As I signed the final documents, I reflected on how completely the power dynamics of our relationship had been reversed over the course of 6 months. The woman who had stood humiliated in that ballroom while her husband announced their separation had not only survived his attempt to erase her professional identity, but had built something more successful than what they had created together. Richardson Strategic was thriving not just as a consulting firm, but as a demonstration that business partnerships could operate on principles of genuine collaboration rather than hierarchical control. Our success was attracting attention from organizations worldwide that were interested in learning how authentic partnership principles could be applied to their own operations. The most satisfying aspect of our resolution wasn't the financial settlement or even the legal vindication, but the recognition that I had successfully defended something meaningful against a systematic attempt to destroy it. The relationships we had built, the innovations we had developed, and the culture we had created were proving to be more resilient and valuable than traditional corporate structures that relied on control and manipulation. As spring moved toward summer, Richardson Strategic continued expanding beyond what I had imagined possible when we began this journey. We were opening offices in 3 additional cities, developing partnerships with international firms that shared our collaborative philosophy, and being invited to speak at conferences about how our model could be applied across different industries. Michael's prediction that I would discover the difficulty of building something independently had proven completely wrong, not because the challenges weren't real, but because I had underestimated my own capabilities and the value of authentic partnerships. The support network I had cultivated, the expertise I had developed, and the reputation I had earned existed independently of his recognition or approval. The final vindication came when Davidson Strategic was indeed acquired by Kendall & Associates, but at a valuation that was significantly lower than what the company might have commanded before our separation. The litigation, the staff departures, and the loss of key client relationships had substantially reduced its market value, while Richardson Strategic's success had demonstrated that the company's most valuable assets had been its people and relationships rather than its corporate structure. Standing in Richardson Strategic's new headquarters, looking out at a team of genuine partners who were building something unprecedented in our industry, I understood that Michael's public announcement of our divorce had ultimately liberated me from limitations I hadn't even recognized. The humiliation that had seemed so devastating at the time had catalyzed a transformation that exceeded anything I might have achieved while remaining constrained by his vision of what our partnership should look like. The emerald dress I had worn that night hung in my closet as a reminder not of embarrassment, but of the moment when I had finally seen clearly who I was beneath the role I had been playing. Richardson Strategic Partners wasn't just succeeding. It was redefining success itself, proving that authentic collaboration could create value that manipulation and control could never match. As summer approached and our first-year anniversary drew near, I began planning a celebration that would honor not just our business achievements, but the transformation we had all experienced. Richardson Strategic had become more than a consulting firm. It was a community of professionals who had discovered that their individual talents were enhanced rather than diminished by genuine partnership. The woman who had been dismissed as a vindictive ex-wife stealing corporate secrets was now being invited to deliver keynote addresses about innovative business models and collaborative leadership. The methodologies that had been characterized as misappropriated trade secrets were being studied by business schools as examples of how traditional consulting approaches could be revolutionized through authentic partnership principles. Most importantly, the relationships that Michael had assumed belonged to corporate entities rather than individual people were proving to be the foundation of something much more valuable than anything he had built through control and manipulation. Richardson's strategic success was demonstrating that business partnerships, like personal relationships, thrived when they were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than power imbalances and strategic advantage. The acquisition announcement arrived exactly 11 months after that devastating holiday party, delivered this time not through legal papers or confrontational phone calls, but through a crisp press release that landed in my email inbox at 7 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. The headline was stark and professional. Richardson Strategic Partners announces acquisition of Davidson Strategic Consulting assets. Below it, in carefully neutral corporate language, was the story of how completely the tables had turned. I read the announcement twice before the full magnitude of what we had accomplished truly registered. Richardson Strategic wasn't just succeeding independently. We had grown large enough and profitable enough to acquire the very company that had tried to destroy us. The irony was so perfect that I had to resist the urge to call Michael immediately and share the moment with the only person who could truly appreciate its significance. The acquisition had been Jennifer's idea, proposed during a strategy meeting. 3 months earlier, when we learned that Kendall and Associates was struggling to integrate Davidson Strategic's operations into their standardized service delivery model, the cultural mismatch between Davidson's client-focused approach and Kendall's efficiency-driven methodology was creating exactly the kind of operational problems that made acquired companies vulnerable to counter-acquisition by more compatible organizations. Kendall paid 40% less than Davidson's pre-litigation valuation, Jennifer had pointed out, pulling up financial analysis on her laptop. But they're discovering that the value they thought they were purchasing was tied to relationships and expertise that don't transfer automatically with corporate ownership. If we structured the right offer, we could probably acquire Davidson's client contracts and operational assets for less than Kendall paid, while also gaining access to the few remaining team members who understand how to serve those clients effectively. The strategic logic was compelling, but the emotional complexity of acquiring my former husband's company required careful consideration. This wasn't just a business opportunity, it was a chance to complete a transformation that had begun with public humiliation and evolved through legal warfare into something approaching poetic justice. The woman who had been dismissed as a vindictive ex-wife would be purchasing the company that had tried to erase her contributions. Dr. Williams, who continued serving as our strategic advisor, had been instrumental in helping me think through the psychological and professional implications of the acquisition. "Sarah, you need to be clear about your motivations," she had said during one of our consultation sessions. "If this is about revenge or vindication, it's probably not a healthy foundation for business expansion. But if it's about genuinely serving clients and creating value, then the personal history becomes secondary to the strategic opportunity." She was right, and the months of due diligence that followed confirmed that the acquisition made sense purely on business merits. Davidson Strategic's remaining clients were exactly the type of organizations that would benefit from Richardson Strategic's collaborative approach. The physical assets, including the downtown office space and technological infrastructure, would support our continued expansion. Most importantly, the 3 senior consultants who had remained at Davidson through all the transitions were professionals we respected and would welcome as partners in our growing organization. The negotiation process revealed just how dramatically Michael's position had deteriorated since our separation. Kendall and Associates was eager to divest Davidson Strategic after discovering that integrating the acquisition was more expensive and disruptive than anticipated. The client retention problems, operational inefficiencies, and cultural conflicts were consuming resources without generating proportional returns. They were willing to accept a significant loss rather than continue investing in an integration that wasn't succeeding. Michael's involvement in the sale negotiations was minimal and carefully managed through intermediaries. The non-compete agreement he had signed with Kendall prevented him from participating directly in consulting work for 2 years, and the acquisition terms had apparently left him with much less financial compensation than he had anticipated. According to industry sources, he was considering opportunities in corporate training and business development, fields that would allow him to use his experience without violating his contractual restrictions. The human element of acquiring my former husband's company proved more complex than the financial and legal aspects. I insisted on meeting personally with each Davidson Strategic employee who would be joining Richardson Strategic, not to conduct adversarial interviews, but to ensure that everyone understood the cultural differences they would be entering and felt genuinely welcomed rather than simply absorbed. The conversations were fascinating and sometimes heartbreaking. Several team members described the gradual deterioration of Davidson Strategic's work environment after my departure, the loss of collaborative decision-making, and the increasing emphasis on individual performance metrics rather than collective success. They had remained with the company out of loyalty and hoped that the situation might improve. But Kendall's acquisition had made clear that the culture they valued was being systematically eliminated. Working at Davidson used to feel like being part of something meaningful, explained Lisa Santos, one of the senior consultants who had been with the original company for 4 years. After you left, it became just another consulting job where you competed with your colleagues for recognition and advancement. When Kendall took over, it got even worse. Everything became about billable hours and standardized procedures. There was no room for innovation or genuine client partnership. Her description confirmed what I had suspected about the impact of my departure on Davidson Strategic's culture. The collaborative approach that had characterized our early success wasn't just a management philosophy that could be transferred to new leadership. It was an organic expression of values and relationships that required ongoing cultivation. Without that foundation, the company had gradually transformed into exactly the kind of traditional consulting firm that Richardson Strategic had been created to replace. The acquisition closing took place in the conference room where Michael had announced our divorce nearly a year earlier, a symbolic choice that several business journalists noted in their coverage of the transaction. This time, however, I was the one standing at the head of the table, surrounded by partners and advisors who represented genuine collaboration rather than hierarchical control. The press coverage of the acquisition was extensive and generally favorable, with business publications treating it as a case study in how entrepreneurial firms could compete successfully against established organizations through superior service, delivery, and innovative business models. Several articles noted the personal dimension of the story, but focused primarily on the professional implications of Richardson Strategic's rapid growth and market success. Forbes published a feature article titled "The Partnership Revolution: How Collaborative Business Models Are Disrupting Traditional Consulting," which used our acquisition of Davidson Strategic as the primary example of how authentic partnership principles could create competitive advantages that traditional hierarchical structures couldn't match. The Harvard Business Review followed with an analysis of our employee ownership model and its impact on productivity, innovation, and client satisfaction. The attention was gratifying, but also somewhat overwhelming. I had never sought to become a spokesperson for alternative business models. But Richardson Strategic's success was being interpreted as evidence that fundamental changes were possible in how professional services firms operated. We began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, participate in academic research projects, and consult with other organizations that wanted to implement similar collaborative approaches. The most meaningful recognition came from Morrison Industries, which nominated Richardson Strategic for the Supplier Excellence Award that recognized outstanding performance in strategic partnership and innovation. The nomination letter, written by James Morrison himself, described our work as transformative not just in terms of results achieved, but in demonstrating how client-consultant relationships can evolve beyond traditional service delivery models to become genuine strategic partnerships. Receiving the award at Morrison's annual supplier conference was particularly satisfying because it represented validation from the client perspective rather than just industry recognition. Morrison Industries had experienced firsthand the difference between working with a traditional consulting firm and partnering with an organization that genuinely shared their goals and challenges. But perhaps the most significant development was entirely unexpected. 3 weeks after the acquisition announcement, I received a handwritten letter from Michael himself, delivered to my office without advance notice or explanation. The envelope contained 2 pages of careful script that revealed a level of introspection I hadn't seen from him during our entire marriage. "Sarah," the letter began, "I've been trying to write this for months, but I kept finding excuses to delay what I knew needed to be said. Watching Richardson Strategic acquire Davidson has forced me to confront realities about myself and our relationship that I've been avoiding since that night at the Fairmont. The letter continued with an acknowledgement that surprised me with its directness and apparent sincerity. Michael wrote about recognizing that his approach to our partnership had been fundamentally flawed, based on assumptions about control and competition that had ultimately destroyed what we had built together. He described watching Richardson Strategic success with a mixture of admiration and regret, understanding finally that my contributions to Davidson Strategic had been essential in ways he had systematically minimized. "You've proven that everything I believed about business partnerships was wrong," he wrote in a passage that I read several times. "I thought success required hierarchy and individual authority, but you've demonstrated that genuine collaboration creates value that control and manipulation can never achieve. I destroyed something meaningful because I couldn't recognize that your strength enhanced rather than threatened mine." The letter concluded with an apology that felt authentic rather than strategic, an acknowledgement of damage that couldn't be repaired, but could at least be honestly recognized. Michael wasn't asking for forgiveness or suggesting that our personal relationship could be restored, but he was taking responsibility for choices that had hurt both of us and ultimately served no one's genuine interests. I shared the letter with Dr. Williams during our next consultation session, curious about her perspective on what had motivated Michael to write it and whether his apparent transformation was likely to be genuine or simply another strategic maneuver, designed to achieve some advantage I couldn't yet identify. People can change, especially when they're forced to confront the consequences of their actions in ways that can't be rationalized or deflected, she observed after reviewing the letter carefully. Michael has spent a year watching you succeed, using principles that directly contradicted everything he believed about business relationships. That kind of evidence is hard to ignore, particularly when it's accompanied by his own professional and financial losses. She paused before adding, "The question isn't whether his recognition is genuine, but whether it matters to your continued development. You've built something extraordinary that exists independently of his acknowledgement or approval. Whether he understands that now is interesting, but it's not essential to Richardson Strategic's future." Her perspective helped me process the emotional complexity of receiving Michael's letter without allowing it to distract from the work of continuing to build and develop Richardson Strategic. The acquisition of Davidson Strategic was complete, but integrating the new team members and clients while maintaining our collaborative culture would require sustained attention and careful management. The integration process revealed both opportunities and challenges that we hadn't fully anticipated. The former Davidson Strategic employees brought valuable expertise and client knowledge, but they also carried habits and expectations that reflected years of working in traditional hierarchical structures. Helping them transition to genuine partnership required patient education and consistent modeling of collaborative decision-making processes. "It's like learning a new language," explained David Park, one of the consultants who had joined us, through the acquisition. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me what to do or how to prioritize competing demands, but instead, everyone expects me to participate in figuring out solutions collaboratively. It's more engaging than traditional management, but it also requires much more personal responsibility and creative thinking." His observation highlighted one of the fundamental differences between Richardson Strategic's approach and conventional consulting firm operations. We expected every team member to function as a genuine partner, rather than simply following instructions or implementing predetermined strategies. This created more demanding work environments, but also generated higher levels of job satisfaction and professional development. The financial results of our first post-acquisition quarter exceeded every projection we had developed. Revenue had increased by 60% compared to the same period the previous year, while client satisfaction scores reached levels that positioned us as the top-rated consulting firm in our region. More importantly, our employee satisfaction metrics indicated that team members were finding their work more meaningful and professionally rewarding than what they had experienced at traditional firms. The The success attracted attention from consulting professionals throughout the industry who were interested in joining an organization that operated on partnership principles rather than hierarchical control. We began receiving unsolicited applications from senior consultants at established firms who wanted to work in environments that valued collaboration over competition and substance over status. The challenge became managing growth without compromising the cultural values that made Richardson Strategic distinctive. Traditional consulting firms could scale by implementing standardized procedures and hierarchical management structures, but our collaborative approach required more careful attention to relationship development and cultural integration. We had to ensure that new team members genuinely embraced partnership principles, rather than simply adapting their behavior to meet new expectations. Dr. Williams suggested that we develop formal mentorship programs and cultural orientation processes. That would help new partners understand not just what we did differently, but why those differences mattered for both professional effectiveness and personal satisfaction. Culture isn't something that happens automatically, she explained. It requires intentional cultivation and protection, especially during periods of rapid growth when there's pressure to prioritize efficiency over relationship development. The mentorship program we implemented paired new partners with experienced team members who could provide guidance on both practical operations and cultural expectations. But rather than creating traditional supervisor-subordinate relationships, we structured these partnerships as mutual learning opportunities, where experienced team members could benefit from fresh perspectives, while newcomers gained insight into collaborative approaches. The program's success led to broader changes in how we approached professional development throughout Richardson Strategic. Instead of traditional performance evaluations that focused on individual achievements, we implemented peer review processes that recognized contributions to collective success. Rather than competing for promotions within established hierarchies, team members worked together to identify growth opportunities that served both personal goals and organizational needs. The transformation was affecting not just how we operated internally, but how we worked with clients and partners throughout the business community. Organizations that had initially engaged Richardson Strategic for specific consulting projects were increasingly interested in learning how our collaborative approaches might be applied to their own operations. We began offering workshops and training programs that taught partnership principles to leadership teams at client companies. The workshop program became particularly popular with family-owned businesses and entrepreneurial organizations that were struggling with growth-related challenges similar to what we had experienced. Many of these companies had been founded on collaborative principles, but had gradually adopted more traditional management structures as they expanded, losing the cultural values that had originally made them successful. What you've demonstrated is that collaborative approaches can scale effectively if they're implemented intentionally rather than accidentally, observed Janet Morrison, who had attended one of our leadership workshops on behalf of Morrison Industries. Most companies assume that growth requires hierarchy, but you've proven that genuine partnership can create competitive advantages that traditional management structures can't match. The recognition led to consulting opportunities with international organizations that were interested in applying our partnership model across different cultural contexts. We began working with firms in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia that wanted to transition from hierarchical structures to more collaborative approaches. Each engagement required careful adaptation of our methodologies to account for different business cultures and regulatory environments. The international expansion also provided opportunities to learn from organizations that had developed their own approaches to collaborative business management. We discovered consulting firms in Northern Europe that had been operating on partnership principles for decades, and social enterprises in Latin America that had created innovative models for balancing profit generation with community development. These cross-cultural exchanges enriched our understanding of how partnership principles could be applied across different contexts, while maintaining their essential characteristics of mutual respect, shared decision-making, and collective responsibility for outcomes. The learning was mutual, with international partners expressing interest in Richardson Strategic's specific approaches to employee ownership and client collaboration. As our second anniversary approached, I found myself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had begun with public humiliation and evolved into professional success that exceeded anything I had imagined possible. Richardson Strategic wasn't just surviving or even thriving. It was helping to redefine what success meant in professional services, demonstrating that business relationships could be based on partnership rather than power, collaboration rather than competition. The annual celebration we planned for our team and clients was held at the same Fairmont Grand Ballroom where Michael had announced our divorce 2 years earlier. This time, however, the gathering represented genuine celebration of shared achievements rather than individual announcements that diminished others. The room was filled with partners, clients, and friends who had participated in building something meaningful together. Standing at the same podium where Michael had delivered his carefully planned separation announcement, I looked out at faces that reflected authentic partnership rather than hierarchical obligation. The contrast was striking and deeply satisfying, not because it represented victory over Michael, but because it demonstrated that alternative approaches to business relationships were not only possible, but superior to traditional models in almost every measurable way. 2 years ago, many of us learned painful lessons about the difference between genuine partnership and strategic manipulation. I began, acknowledging the personal dimension of our story without dwelling on past injuries. Tonight, we're celebrating what becomes possible when professional relationships are built on mutual respect, shared values, and authentic collaboration. The applause that followed wasn't the polite response typical of corporate events, but genuine enthusiasm from people who had experienced firsthand the benefits of working in an environment that valued their individual contributions while supporting collective success. Richardson Strategic had become more than a consulting firm. It was a demonstration that business could be conducted in ways that enhanced rather than diminished everyone involved. The evening concluded with the announcement of our next major initiative, the Richardson Institute for Collaborative Leadership, a nonprofit organization that would research, develop, and teach partnership approaches to business management. The institute would work with academic institutions, professional organizations, and individual companies to advance understanding of how collaborative principles could be applied across different industries and cultural contexts. The institute represented the next evolution of what had begun as a defensive response to personal and professional attack. What started as a strategy for survival had grown into a mission for transformation, demonstrating that individual success could be aligned with broader social value rather than achieved at others' expense. As the celebration continued and I moved through conversations with partners and clients who had become genuine friends, I understood that the woman who had stood frozen in humiliation 2 years earlier had discovered something much more valuable than vindication or revenge. She had learned that authentic success came not from defeating others, but from creating value that enhanced everyone's capabilities and opportunities. Richardson Strategic was proof that business relationships could operate on principles of genuine partnership, that professional success could be aligned with personal integrity, and that collaborative approaches could generate results that traditional hierarchical structures couldn't match. The acquisition of Davidson Strategic had been the final chapter in one story, but it was also the beginning of something much larger and more meaningful than anything Michael and I had ever built together. 5 years have passed since that transformative evening at the Fairmont Grand Ballroom, and as I prepare for Richardson Strategic's 5th anniversary celebration, I find myself marveling at how completely my life has been reimagined. The company that began as a desperate response to professional betrayal has evolved into an international organization with offices on 4 continents, serving clients who seek not just consulting services, but genuine transformation of how they approach business relationships and organizational culture. This morning, I received confirmation that Richardson Strategic has been selected to deliver the keynote presentation at the Global Business Ethics Summit in Geneva, where I'll be addressing an audience of CEOs, government leaders, and researchers about how collaborative business models can address some of the most pressing challenges facing modern organizations. The invitation represents recognition that our approach has transcended the consulting industry to influence broader conversations about corporate responsibility, sustainable development, and ethical leadership. The woman who once stood paralyzed while her husband publicly dismantled her professional identity now travels the world teaching others how to build organizations that honor both individual potential and collective success. The transformation feels both surreal and completely natural, as if the person I've become was always waiting beneath the accommodating wife and marginalized partner I had allowed myself to become. Richardson Strategic's growth has been extraordinary, but more meaningful than the financial success or industry recognition is the impact we've had on thousands of professionals who have discovered alternatives to traditional hierarchical business structures. Our employee ownership model has been adopted by over 200 companies worldwide, creating workplaces where people feel genuinely valued and empowered rather than simply managed and evaluated. The Richardson Institute for Collaborative Leadership has become a recognized authority on partnership-based business models, working with organizations ranging from technology startups to government agencies to implement approaches that prioritize sustainability, innovation, and human development. Our research has been published in leading academic journals and business publications, contributing to a growing body of evidence that collaborative approaches consistently outperform traditional management structures across multiple performance metrics. Perhaps most satisfying is the personal growth that has accompanied professional success. The confidence and strategic thinking that were systematically undermined during my marriage have not only returned, but evolved beyond what I possessed before meeting Michael. The experience of rebuilding from complete professional devastation taught me capabilities I might never have discovered if my original career path had continued uninterrupted. I've learned that authentic power comes not from controlling others, but from creating environments where everyone can contribute their best work. True leadership isn't about individual authority, but about facilitating collective achievement that exceeds what any individual could accomplish alone. Most importantly, I've discovered that personal fulfillment and professional success are not only compatible, but mutually reinforcing when work is aligned with genuine values and meaningful relationships. The relationships within Richardson Strategic continue to exemplify the collaborative principles that guide our client work. Jennifer, who took the enormous risk of joining our startup during its most uncertain early months, now serves as our Chief Operating Officer and has become one of the most respected voices in the consulting industry on topics of organizational culture and employee engagement. Her courage in supporting our venture when it seemed impossibly ambitious helped establish the foundation for everything we've achieved since. Dr. Williams remains our senior advisor and has co-authored several papers with me on the psychological and organizational benefits of genuine partnership structures. Her academic research, combined with our practical experience, has created a unique perspective on how collaborative approaches can address workplace stress, improve decision-making, quality, and enhance both individual satisfaction and organizational performance. The team members who joined us through the Davidson Strategic acquisition have become some of our most effective ambassadors for collaborative business models, having experienced firsthand the difference between working in traditional hierarchical environments and participating in genuine partnership structures. Their insights about transition processes have been invaluable as we've helped other organizations implement similar transformations. Our client relationships have evolved far beyond traditional consulting arrangements to become ongoing partnerships that generate mutual learning and continuous innovation. Morrison Industries, our first major client, has implemented collaborative management approaches throughout their organization and credits these changes with improving both employee satisfaction and financial performance. They've become a case study that other companies reference when considering similar organizational transformations. The international expansion of Richardson Strategic has revealed how universal the desire for meaningful work and authentic relationships truly is. Whether working with technology companies in Silicon Valley, manufacturing firms in Germany, or social enterprises in Brazil, we consistently encounter professionals who are seeking alternatives to traditional business structures that often feel dehumanizing and counterproductive. Each cultural context requires adaptation of our specific methodologies, but the core principles of mutual respect, shared decision-making, and collective responsibility translate remarkably well across different business environments. The success of our international offices has demonstrated that collaborative approaches aren't limited to particular industries or cultural contexts, but represent fundamental improvements in how human beings can work together effectively. The financial results continue to exceed expectations, with Richardson Strategic generating revenue that surpasses what Davidson Strategic ever achieved, while maintaining profit margins that support our generous employee ownership structure, and substantial investments in professional development and community engagement. We've proven that treating employees as genuine partners rather than disposable resources isn't just ethically superior, but also economically advantageous. More important than financial metrics, however, are the personal stories of transformation that we encounter regularly. Team members who had previously felt trapped in unfulfilling jobs have discovered careers that align with their values and utilize their full capabilities. Clients who had struggled with organizational dysfunction have created workplaces that their employees genuinely enjoy and where innovation flourishes naturally. These individual transformations aggregate into broader social impact that extends far beyond our immediate business operations. Richardson Strategic alumni have founded dozens of companies that operate on collaborative principles, creating an expanding network of organizations that prioritize partnership over hierarchy, sustainability over short-term profit, and human development over efficiency maximization. The ripple effects are beginning to influence entire industries as collaborative approaches demonstrate superior results across multiple performance measures. Business schools are incorporating our methodologies into their curricula, consulting firms are adopting partnership structures, and corporate leaders are questioning traditional assumptions about management and organizational design. My personal life has been equally transformed through this journey. The painful process of extricating myself from a relationship that had become fundamentally manipulative taught me to recognize and maintain healthy boundaries while remaining open to authentic connection and mutual support. I've learned to distinguish between compromise that strengthens relationships and accommodation that undermines individual integrity. The confidence that comes from building something meaningful from nothing has influenced every aspect of how I approach challenges and opportunities. Problems that once seemed overwhelming now feel like puzzles to be solved through creative thinking and collaborative effort. Setbacks that might previously have felt like personal failures are now simply information that helps refine strategies and improve future performance. Most significantly, I've discovered that success achieved through authentic means is far more satisfying and sustainable than any victory obtained through manipulation or at others' expense. Richardson Strategic's growth feels meaningful precisely because it has enhanced rather than diminished the opportunities available to everyone involved. The anniversary celebration this evening will take place in Richardson Strategic's new headquarters, a building designed specifically to support collaborative work and community engagement. Unlike traditional corporate offices that emphasize hierarchy through spatial design, our space features flexible meeting areas, shared resource centers, and common spaces that encourage informal interaction and relationship building. The guest list includes not just our current team and clients, but many of the people who supported our development during the most challenging early periods. Representatives from Morrison Industries, the academic colleagues who validated our approaches, the legal team that defended our rights, and the business journalists who helped tell our story accurately rather than accepting Michael's preferred narrative about vindictive ex-wives and stolen intellectual property. As I prepare my remarks for this evening, I reflect on the extraordinary journey that began with public humiliation and evolved through legal warfare, strategic counterattack, and ultimate triumph into something much more significant than personal: vindication. Richardson Strategic represents proof that business can be conducted in ways that honor both individual potential and collective welfare, that professional success can be aligned with ethical principles, and that collaborative approaches consistently outperform traditional hierarchical structures. The woman who stood frozen in that emerald green dress while her marriage and career were publicly dismantled has been replaced by someone who understands that authentic power comes from creating value rather than controlling others. That genuine security is built through capability and relationships rather than manipulation and dependence, and that the most satisfying success comes from achievements that benefit everyone involved rather than victories won at others' expense. Tonight, I'll be wearing emerald again, not as armor against anticipated attack, but as a celebration of growth, renewal, and the continuous possibility of transformation. The color that once represented my grandmother's strength now symbolizes my own journey from accommodation to authentic leadership, from marginalized partner to recognized innovator, from individual survivor to community builder. Richardson Strategic's success has demonstrated that the most devastating betrayals can become catalysts for discovering capabilities we never knew we possessed, that systematic attempts to diminish us can ultimately reveal strengths that manipulation had kept hidden, and that the courage to rebuild from complete destruction can lead to achievements that exceed anything we might have imagined possible while constrained by others' limited vision of our potential. The future holds possibilities that continue to exceed my most optimistic projections. Richardson Strategic is expanding into new markets and developing innovative approaches to organizational transformation. The Richardson Institute is launching research initiatives that will influence policy discussions about corporate responsibility and economic justice. Most importantly, the collaborative principles we've demonstrated are being adopted by organizations worldwide, creating a growing movement toward business practices that prioritize human flourishing alongside financial success. As I look forward to this evening's celebration and the continued evolution of everything we've built together, I'm filled with gratitude for the journey that brought me to this point, including the painful experiences that forced me to discover who I really was beneath the roles I had been playing. Michael's betrayal, devastating as it felt at the time, ultimately liberated me from limitations I hadn't even recognized and catalyzed the development of capabilities that have enriched not just my own life, but the lives of countless others who have participated in building Richardson Strategic. The emerald dress hanging in my closet serves as a reminder that our most challenging moments often contain the seeds of our greatest transformations, that the courage to refuse diminishment can lead to discoveries about our authentic potential, and that the choice to build rather than simply survive can create value that extends far beyond our individual circumstances. Tonight's celebration will honor not just what we've achieved, but the principles that guided our journey. That authentic partnership creates value that control and manipulation cannot match, that individual success and collective welfare are complementary rather than competitive, and that the most meaningful victories are those that enhance everyone's opportunities rather than diminish others' possibilities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.